This is Dialogue. Dialogue, a presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News.
This is Dialogue Assassination with research specialist Mae Bressel. For KLRB, I'm Gloria Barron.
All right. Thanks and welcome to Mae and the Magic Bullet tonight. Just to go over Mae's feelings and quote about some of this stuff. She says, "There's no safety in silence. You people that sit there and don't speak up or shout, I'll shout until I die. Remember when I saw those people, I knew they had died. I said I'd rather live 1 hour the way I'm living than to sit there like a zombie and let it happen and not speak up. And that's why we're here today. And that's what's going on in the world today. So that's why we're here. We're here to talk about it. And we're going to talk about Mark Lane, and we're going to put him in historical context to some of the things that are happening today. We have Mike Nimitz with us to help us put those things in context. And who was Mark Lane? Well, Mae Bressel says that she was happy to have hated his guts. So why is that? Let's do a little digging and see what Mark's all about. Well, in the January 15th, 1978 episode of Dialogue Assassination, Mae talks about the Power and Control Group and that Mark Lane was a part of this Power and Control Group. What is that? Is that part of Operation Mockingbird? Well, we'll kind of leave that to you all to understand and think about. But the Power and Control Group is a group of specific lawyers, researchers, newspaper people that are trained to speak, give lectures, manage trials without giving away too much information. So they kind of rabbit hole things. And at one point, as a good example, she mentioned Larry Flynt putting up $1 million for information about the Kennedy assassination, but it had to go through Mark Lane and Dick Gregory, the gatekeepers, kind of like a Noam Chomsky type gatekeeper of the left. And the major media, news media, they can go to the Rockefeller Commission, they can go and sit on committees and create the cover-ups, but Mae wasn't allowed to testify. She wasn't allowed to go. She was called a conspiracy theorist, and she was worried that people would come to harm after they submitted their evidence to this group. Evidence was destroyed. All throughout these investigations, witnesses were killed. Mae was threatened off the air twice. So it wasn't an idle threat. It wasn't an idle concern. There were a lot of things going on. And she goes on and talks about the cover-ups and how some of the cover-ups that she saw and lived through. The first one was the Warren Commission. And then the second was Bernard Fensterwall's investigation. He represented a Watergate burglar and as an attorney, and that was kind of the outing of Bernard Fensterwall as an agent. Up until that time, he had kind of fronted himself as a researcher and went to the conferences and published. But if you dig into the history, you can see how these people are connected. And then there was the Assassination Information Board conference in Boston, which Mark Lane put on. And I just today listened to a tape of a podcast of Mae's speech there. It was like an hour and 20 minutes and just fantastic set of information because she summarizes a lot of what she did for a new audience. And that takes a lot of consideration, understanding that the people that she's speaking with every week, they have context. Like these people might not have had all the context that those people had. But she said that, they excluded really the real researchers, and we'll look a little bit more at that in the presentation. And Mark Lane, Robert Groden, Dick Gregory, those are the only people allowed to go to the press conference and summarize the findings of the review board. And she says that he moved to Washington after that to investigate the Kennedy assassination. And there were several congressional committees, and we'll talk a little bit about that, where she said before this committee was over, about a year while they were into it, that they'll end their investigation saying that Oswald didn't do it alone, but they don't know who did. And it'll cost the taxpayers $2 million in 2 years, and it'll be a massive cover up. And absolutely, that's exactly what happened. They said, Oswald fired 3 shots, and there was the fourth shot, maybe from the grassy knoll, that missed. And that's all we really know. And yeah, people were kind of negligent about the investigation. There's some evidence was suppressed, but all in all, that's just about it. And then after that, uh, Mark Lane had moved to California. Remember, if you will, that he during this time period a little bit later was involved in Jonestown. He was Jim Jones's attorney at one point, and once he found out that the Congressman Leo Ryan was going to go down to Guyana and check it out, he sprinted down there to front run that for Jim Jones. And some people think that he triggered the mass suicide / murder down there because he freaked Jim Jones out about what was about to happen with a congressional visit. Then Larry Flynn bought the Los Angeles Free Press, and he invited people to submit their evidence. It had to go through Mark Lane and Dick Gregory and another set of people. So they were gatekeeping that evidence. And then finally, Larry Flint had some weird conversion to Christianity and brought in Paul Krasner, who May really liked and was a trusted publisher of the Realist magazine, but he was bankrupt. And I think Larry Flint bought him off. And she had said that she could, he told her that she could publish about anything. She could write about anything except for Lee Harvey Oswald. So of course she sent him an article about Lee Harvey Oswald, and she's like, "That bastard doesn't print this thing, then I know he's owned, right?" And so that's just kind of woman she was. And she says that Jack Anderson, who was, I think he was a Washington Post or New York Times longtime commentator, columnist guy, a friend of Frank Sturgis, who was at the Kennedy assassination. He was a anti-Castro Cuban. He was a Watergate burglar. So he was deep in with Howard Hunt, Howard Hunt, and the secret team that did the Kennedy assassination and the Watergate burglary. And she's saying that, this is why Anderson never talked about political assassinations or conspiracies, even though researchers had sent him information for 20 years. So they open up an investigation. Here's a conduit for the mainstream media. And really, it's just a black hole, from which no truth or good information comes out unless they're really feet are held to the fire. So moving on a little bit. So who was Mark Lane? Well, this article talks about how he owned the American Free Press and something like the Liberty Lobby as well. So he was kind of controlling those quasi right-wing opposition groups, or let Amos in here. So he was kind of controlling those quasi right-wing publishing avenues or information avenues. And this is here saying that, hey, he was engaged to Suzanne Irma Wecht, daughter of Miss Henry Wecht of Brooklyn, Mark B. Lane. He was a son of Mr. and Mrs. Harry Lane, and the bride to be. And Mark served with Army intelligence in the war and attended Long Island University and as a second year after the Brooklyn Law School. So that doesn't mean much to people who don't understand what serving with Army intelligence after the war means. But in all suspicion is that he worked with the OSS, and people who were working in Germany and Army intelligence after the war, they were propagandists and they were looking to control the narrative. And indeed, this is kind of what he ended up doing over time as well. And this author is saying that he was also involved in the MLK case. He represented James Earl Ray for some period of time. And he was involved in the Jonestown massacre. And then what did he do to expose the truth about these things? Absolutely nothing. And his real purpose was to make sure that the truth remained hidden in these court cases. So this author refers to Phil Berg doing the same thing to 9/11 victims. I haven't had a chance to get into investigate Phil Berg yet, but looking for examples of these people are handling sensitive information or truth or burying it. And so there's a lot of, and they do have to get their bona fides some way, right? So initially, Mark Lane, after he had heard of the Kennedy assassination, he went down to interview witnesses and understand what was happening. And then he got himself into a position where he was Marguerite Oswald's attorney. So he kind of fenced her off from any information. And he came out with a book, Rush to Judgment. I think it was in 1966, which I actually really enjoyed. Like I thought that was a good book. And I think that's his bona fides, was to give as much as he could without giving too much away. He just kind of asked questions, right? He asked the questions, but he didn't provide a whole lot of answers. And when it came to start to be time to provide answers, he always backed away from the lectern and kind of put up a big ink cloud and ran away from the answers. So an interesting part about Mark was that he was connected with Bertrand Russell. And at the time, Bertrand Russell was seen as kind of a critic of the Warren Report. He had a famous publication called 16 Questions about the Kennedy assassination. It was pretty interesting. And he read, I think, Rush to Judgment. And he was involved before this, of course, but the story goes he read Rush to Judgment, and he came up with this Who Killed Kennedy committee, which was actually the British Who Killed Kennedy committee. And it consisted of a bunch of people, but the interesting people were, I think, of course, Russell himself, Mark Lane, and then Hugh Trevor Roper. And I think I've got this piece here where it says that whenever Lane delved into substantive issues around the Kennedy assassination, that this reviewer's hair stood on end. So he wrote a book called Ingratitude, and he cites his treasured friends and old allies in a struggle to unearth the truth about the JFK assassination. And that's Bertrand Russell, Arnold Toynbee, and Hugh Trevor Roper, all senior figures in British intelligence establishment. And when he surfaced as an investigator on the assassination plot, he was sponsored by an outfit with an unlikely name, the British Who Killed Kennedy Committee. And Bertrand Russell, Hugh Trevor Roper, two of the group's sponsors. And he does a report in plausible deniability. And Trevor Roper wrote the introduction to the British edition of the book Rush to Judgment. Pretty interesting. And yeah, that was an early swipe at the Warren Commission. And like I said, I enjoyed the book. I thought it was a good first introduction to what might have been off with the Warren Commission. And this author is saying that Bertrand Russell, perhaps more than anyone else, personified the Anglo-American grouping that hated JFK and benefited most from his assassination. Well, that's pretty interesting. Then why would Bertrand Russell go and ask questions about the assassination if he hated JFK? And I think that was their way of gaining that entry into the playing field where they could obfuscate truth and information. And why would Alan Dulles agree to go onto the Warren Commission after he was fired by JFK? Why would he be interested in understanding what was going on with the JFK assassination? Well, maybe because he had something to do with it and had some things to hide. And having a front row seat or a director's chair on the commission, you could point the clues in where you wanted them to go. And something that kind of came up was that this cable from Bertrand Russell to President Kennedy at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Bertrand Russell says to Kennedy, "Hey, your actions are desperate. threat to human survival, no conceivable justification. Civilized man condemns it, will not have mass murder. Ultimatum means war, end this madness, right? So he's not too happy with Kennedy at that point. And he's saying that, yeah, his involvement with the Kennedy assassination afterwards was prompted by the work of Mark Lane. And he rallied a bunch of left-leaning compatriots to form the British Who Killed Kennedy Commission in June of 1964. And yeah, he published the 16 questions on the assassination, equating the Oswald case with the Dreyfus affair, saying they convicted an innocent man. And he criticized the American press for failing to heed any voice of critical of the official version. So as a critic or as a controlled opposition, you get to control the narrative. And you get to criticize whatever the heck you want. And so back to Mark Lane, he is like a complex character as well, and he did some things that many would say were positive, right? He represented the American Indian movement in 1974, and he joined William Kunstler. Kunstler was a left defendant. He defended the mob. He defended the Weather Underground. He'd be a person to look into and follow up on as well. And he was the former director of the American Civil Liberties Union. They successfully defended Russell Means and Dennis Banks against federal charges for an uprising at Wounded Knee in February of 1973. So they occupied the town. They had a 71-day standoff with federal marshals and FBI agents, and that kind of brought me immediately, like the Bundy Ranch thing popped into my head, and also Waco popped into my head. And so they're saying that this author also says that Mark was behind some of these right-leaning publications, and he was behind the American Free Press, and they were kind of there to control the patriotic movement, and they were skimming the cream off of it. So they were taking all the sting out of it. They're taking the money, and the Liberty Lobby also, they paid $5 million to Mark Lane in legal fees. So he was getting paid, and he said that he represented Jim Jones on the side. What in reality he was getting paid to represent Jim Jones. And then it's like, okay, well, where did all this money come from? All right, that's a different story. Don't exactly know the end of that. So this is kind of a little bit about this Assassination Information Bureau conference that they did in 1975. So here's a link to May's presentation. Really interesting. Highly recommend you check that out if you get time. And it says the New York Times on February 3rd, 1975, critics of the Warren Report meet to ask for a new study. And some interesting tidbits from the article are that even then, 11 years after, 78% of the American people don't believe the Warren Commission. So they were kind of like educated. Look, I'm sure that all that's kind of faded from memory, and kids aren't taught history. They don't do investigations necessarily. So I'm sure that's probably fallen. Like people don't even know what the Warren Commission is, but it's like the 9/11 Commission was the same thing, right? It was just a whitewash to protect the people who were in power and who caused these things to happen. And so this article in New York Times, which I think is illustrative of how they treat the alternative views, if it's not the view of the mainstream press. So they're saying that the more controversial of these self-styled researchers were Mae Brussel, who's a syndicated radio host and writes for the Realist magazine, and Sherman Skolnick, who helped force the resignation of 3 Illinois judges. Speaking in a strident voice, her words tumbling over one another, the California-based Mae Brussel described spending 8 years cross-indexing 90 notebooks of everyone who had ever met Lee Harvey Oswald, and her conviction that Sirhan convicted shooting convicted shooting of Robert Kennedy was smuggled into the country by the same CIA network as Marina Oswald under the cover of the Greek Orthodox Church. So to reduce her cross-indexing of the 90 notebooks to just a whoever met Lee Harvey Oswald. I mean, I don't know where to start with that. But to me, this group that brought Sirhan, that kind of points back to the Galen work. And I think we need to like crack into the Galen work pretty hard at some point, because that seems to be the connecting point of a lot of this nasty business. The Galen org, the MK Ultra, the Operation Paperclip, and even feeding into the Kennedy assassination with Walter Dornberger and all the paperclip Nazis being involved in Dallas, and the white Russians who were Nazi sympathizers like George de Mohrenschildt. And, they were Nazi sympathizers because of the Russian Revolution. The socialists and communists stole all of their land and oil producing things, and everyone who was in the oligarchy or the monarchy or related to them was either slaughtered or escaped. And so there was a lot of resentment to the communists in the white Russian community. And so they were aligned with the enemy of my enemy is my friend, with the Nazis. So the Galen org is a big factor in a lot of this business. And May says J. Edgar Hoover was murdered. She snapped in response to a question. He ingested apple pie and there were Cubans in his house. I'll stake my reputation on it. Well, I wouldn't want to argue with her on that, because she's figured a lot of stuff out. Mr. Skolnick, who is confined to a wheelchair, contended that the Chicago airplane crash in which the wife of E. Howard Hunt Jr. died had been caused by CIA sabotage. Well, that's pretty interesting. What's that all about? E. Howard Hunt, who was seen as one of the three tramps in the Kennedy assassination, led away from the rail line, and also convicted in the Watergate break-in. He knew a lot. He was kind of blackmailing the CIA to get his ass out of jail, and I think they ended up paying him off. But at the same time, his wife Dorothy was traveling to Chicago, and I think there was a newscaster on the flight as well, and she had a bunch of documents, and they sabotaged the plane. It crashed right outside of O'Hare in a residential neighborhood. Witnesses said that FBI was on the scene before the fire resources to clean the place up. And what Skolnick is saying, that there was a document which should have been written on asbestos. It fluttered from the plane, became stuck on a bush, and came into his possession. It was a National Security Council memorandum of November 27th, 1960, 3 years to the date before, saying for the good of the Republic, JFK should be removed. And I don't know anything about that. It kind of reminds me of the Muhammad Atta's passport flying out of the World Trade Centers. But maybe there's something to it, because there were a lot of documents. And so this is saying, oh, Mr. Lane, he was visibly upset by such charges. And in the closing session, when the petitions urging new investigation were distributed, warned against reaching conclusions beyond what could be substantiated. We should not make statements that most reasonable Americans cannot accept, he said. We cannot require an acceptance of the unbelievable. It'll set us back 20 years. It is their credibility that must be at stake, not ours. So he's pulling the big wet blanket over any information that doesn't conform to the mainstream narrative at this point. And was his job. Like that's one of the things that he did. So just a couple of things that were going on at that time, like people, they had just seen the Zapruder film, and people were upset about that because they had been lied to. And I think that came out in 77, 76, and Geraldo Rivera, I think, watched it, brought it out on mainstream TV, which was and Dick Gregory was there, the comedian, on that show. So the controlled gatekeepers brought it out first. And so there was a lot of things happening in that period of the mid 70s, which we'll go into in some depth on later discussions. But the church committee was happening, House Select Committee on Assassinations, and this was 1978 was the time of Jonestown, November 1978, and when Mark Lane was his assassination information show in Boston kind of got the Congress tuned up to do another investigation. So he went down to Washington and he was kind of controlling the investigations as much as he could, or at least he got them kicked off and put them into friendly hands. But they, this is where they raised all the questions about the covert activity. And you see Frank Church holding up the gun. And there were, you might remember the testimony of, I don't know if it was head of the CIA or some deputies or something saying about got into placing assets into newsrooms around the country. And he said, well, that's better that we take this offline, right, and discuss this in committee so that the American people can't really see what's going on here. But I think Mockingbird was much bigger than even we maybe think it was. And maybe these lawyers and certainly the media people were there, but I hadn't really thought about the fact that lawyers could have been included in the Mockingbird plan. And here's Robert Heinlein, which this makes a lot of sense relevantly. When any government or any church for that matter undertakes to say to its subjects, this you may not read, this you must not see, this you are forbidden to know, the end result is tyranny and oppression, no matter how holy the motives. I think we're getting a strong dose of that right now. But the church committee, 75 and 76, I just wanted to read this, right? The most shocking revelations of the church committee included Operation MK Ultra, involving the drugging and torturing of unwitting U.S. citizens as part of human experimentation on mind control. And we've talked a lot about that related to Jonestown in the past and what was going on out in San Francisco at the Vacaville prison. And that was going on at universities and prisons all across North America, funding flowing everywhere. COINTELPRO, involving the surveillance and infiltration of American political and civil rights organizations. Now, what they don't say is all the assassinations of the Black Panthers and the left leaders and the people that were slaughtered as a part of COINTELPRO by the FBI Division 5 and the LAPD and on and on. And then the Family Jewels, the CIA program to covertly assassinate foreign leaders. And then Operation Mockingbird, of course, the systematic propaganda campaign with domestic and foreign journalists operating as CIA assets, dozens of U.S. news organizations providing cover for CIA activity. And they also uncovered Project Shamrock, which major telecommunications companies had shared their traffic directly with the NSA. And that came out over and over and over with AT&T and Apple and Google and on and on. So we're seeing the legacy of these things hitting us in the face right now. And I listened to Whitney Webb this week, and she was saying how, the Epstein, she talked about the Epstein network. She's got a book coming out in September. And Elaine, and of course, the perpetrators will not be named because the perpetrators are the ones who control who gets named, and they're in charge basically. But what she was saying is that with all this electronic surveillance that they have now, they don't need fixers like Epstein anymore. Like he became kind of a dinosaur, and that network, because they have access, really it's like a mob / intelligence network. They have access to all the NSA data, to the phones, to the videos, to the speech, everything, the location, GIS data. They don't need Epstein anymore, right? They can blackmail people just based on their electronic information. So it's pretty both sick and sad and disgusting once you dig into that, as we did a little bit last week with Presidio and Michael Aquino and Epstein, but really just a blackmail operation, which they don't necessarily need that many people or do it in the same way anymore. Um, yeah, and they try to preserve some records with this assassination records review board, and they all of the records were supposed to come out, I think, in what was it, 2017, and then Trump bottled them up again, and then Biden agreed and bottled them up again. So, I mean, it's loosely in the football, and who knows what's even in those documents. If there were anything important in there, they wouldn't release them to us anyway. So they're liable to provide a little nugget, but we're not going to know what those real documents are or were. In fact, I think Richard Helms said he gave the order to destroy all the MK Ultra documents, but there were still some that survived, and that's how we kind of piece together the story. All right. So this is a little bit more about Mark, right? There was an author who went out to talk to him, and he was kind of referring to how he had this relationship with Terry Buford, 26-year-old woman who was at Jonestown. And what happened in Jonestown, as we talked about a little bit before, was people defected towards the end when they knew the end was coming. And then they turned against Jim Jones so that they could have plausible deniability. And that's kind of what Mark Lane did, although he only did it after the fact. And he was a lawyer for Jim Jones, and they had a public relations problem because he kept saying that, hey, Jonestown was an incredible experiment with such vast potential for the human spirit and the soul of this country. So it's paradise on earth down there in Jonestown. So how are we going to turn that around? Like, how did it turn into a hellhole? And maybe you weren't telling the truth or something. I don't know. So he turned the PR problem into a profit maker because he began to write books and things about that. And he turned it into some kind of a retro reverse conspiracy where, the intelligence operations conspired against Jim Jones because he was going to migrate to the Soviet Union. And, then he's talking about how he's going to get to the bottom of this, and he's going to do his own investigation and figure everything out, even though he was there on the day of, right? And he was directly involved. So this is another article that says, yeah, he owns the Liberty Lobby and the American Free Press. He was the lawyer for Jim Jones, and he was present during the massacre and is considered to have been the person who instigated it by scaring Jim Jones to the point of desperation. Well, I don't know if that's true, but there's probably quite a bit of desperation there when he understood that the congressman was going to come down and do a little investigation of the scene. But I'm sure it was programmed to self-destruct at some point anyway, because why would they be rehearsing the White Knight suicide practice with all the people there? And yeah, he was a lawyer for James Earl Ray at one point, and there was an expulcatory evidence. I'll have to look that word up again, but evidence that the keeper of the inn, I forgot what her name was, saw James Earl Ray at the time of the MLK shooting. And then she was shuffled off to a mental hospital for years. And Lane was set to represent her. And during these hearings about the MLK, JFK, RFK assassinations in the mid 70s, he had just kind of had her living at his house so that she couldn't get out of his sight. And then he kept her and James Earl Ray from, I think James Earl Ray did testify actually, but she did not testify. And that was the time when he ran off to Jonestown, same time. So this article is saying that, now why would a high-level PSYOP agent like Mark Lane, remember he's in Army intelligence, be interested in running the American Free Press which uses scare tactics. What's the real connection between Jonestown and the American Free Press? What the heck's going on here, folks? And this additional article says that this is Christopher Bolin, and he has his own issues, but he's saying that after being fired from the American Free Press, he learned that Mark Lane is the real owner of the Liberty Library and its assets, and has been since 1994. So the American Free Press was the other group that Mark Lane owned. And this came from L.T. Patterson of Cincinnati, owner of the newsletter Criminal Politics. So Patterson had been sued by Mark Lane in an attempt to shut down his newspaper, and discovered that Lane owed the Liberty Lobby during the legal process. Mark Lane served in Army intelligence in Germany at the end of the war. Army intelligence became the CIA after the war. And Lane played a key role in Jonestown. Yep, he pushed the fear button. This is the claim. And he's a controlling agent of the American Free Press. And I think that's a good moniker, the controlling agent. It pushes the fear button of patriotic Americans every week. So kind of reminds me of the Q conspiracy, right? The pushing the fear button of Americans every week and giving them just a little dab of hope that the white hats are going to come in and save them if you just stay with the plan. And he was involved in the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War, where he worked closely with Jane Fonda. And later Fonda married Ted Turner, and she convinced him to sell CNN to Time Warner. And here's Jane Fonda and Mark Lane in 1970. So how did you get connected in with that network? And then what did CNN actually become but some kind of a psyop propaganda mouthpiece for cultural Marxism? I mean, it's just disgusting what that became.
Hey guys.
Hey, Amos.
Hey, I just wanted to mention that one thing Bolin doesn't shy away from, and I think that it really kind of is hidden in all of this, or maybe I'm looking at it in the wrong way, but is the Zionist and the Zionism aspect.
Yeah.
How much are they, how much were they involved in, and had to do with everything from Kennedy's assassination through all this stuff. And I don't know. I just think that that's something that, you really, it just, I don't know why you're not seeing more of it, because they really did have a big role to play in so many things going on in the, in all of this, all of these, the stuff that's going on with trying to control and a lot of this counterinsurgency stuff, the backdoor. Anyway,
the Promise software, right? The Promise software.
Promise software, exactly. I mean, they really have been deeply involved, and of course, and basically, I think they're basically an arm of British, of the British, but anyway, I don't know. I just thought I'd throw that out there real quick, man. I didn't mean to interrupt. You got a nice flow going. So
no, we're coming to the end, and I appreciate you interrupting me and asking questions. That's a great point. And it kind of leads me back to Robert Maxwell and the Mega Group and Les Wexner, and the Limited, and Victoria's Secret and Epstein, and
right.
And Ghislaine Maxwell. And I think Whitney Webb does a fantastic job of like tying all that stuff in a bow. It's just that there's so much material, and I'm trying to internalize and see the spider web of connections.
Yeah, before I forget, and I start rambling and then I can't remember the hell I was going to say, and that was that LBJ, if I've read a couple of places that it may be bullshit, was a cryptic Jew, and I think his mother's sister. Anyway, I think he was deeply involved with the Palestinian, with the Jews fighting Palestine and getting them guns and stuff like that. I read that in a few places. So, if that has some ties into Kennedy's assassination, which, we know LBJ, is playing a big role in the conspiracy theories perspective, it's worth exploring a little bit. Anyway, I'm out. I'm listening, and love what you're doing, man.
Well, thanks, Amos, for that. I think it's interesting that the connections of Zionism to these assassinations and the potential for it. Jacob Rubenstein, aka Jack Ruby, connected to the Jewish mafia, and certainly the Italian mafia had a lot to do with these things as well. Santos Trafficante, Johnny Rosselli, and the people who ended up in barrels in Biscayne Bay before they testified. And the merger of these intelligence agencies with the mafia occurred earlier, right in time, and they used each other. And what we're seeing now is, I think, a flip of the script where mafia has so infiltrated government that there's really no difference. They're one and the same, and you're seeing that there's two or three sets of just us, if you could call it that, where some people are above and some people are below, and there's no limit to what they get away with, and it's just right in your face, and it's pretty disgusting.
I wanted to touch on a couple things that I heard in the thing that I thought were important. The idea of really kind of creating a funnel for a particular kind of interest or conspiracy. And certainly like in the JFK circumstance, Mark Lane is really kind of the guy that's guiding the conspiracy theorists around the JFK assassination. So he's the guy that everybody is going to, and to some degree, he's creating this funnel. And the way that she describes this idea of like the power control group being something that creates a series of controlled escalations. So when he's doing these news events and they're creating these news events, they're also kind of prepared with all these different people. And she goes through, Mark and Robert Groden and his ability with Time Life to, basically publish anything, publish any book, get magazine articles, get New York Times, releases. George O'Toole with the CIA, Paul Hawke with the defense industry, Carl Oglesby, Dick Gregory with the entertainment, industry. Essentially, each person is kind of creating this organization. It's almost an entrepreneurial organization of control that has access to all these different specialties that, hey, if you're willing to pay for this, we're certainly willing to facilitate making it happen. And so I think to some degree, this is almost like the contractors that facilitate the social engineering. That there's the guys that are devising the bigger plans, but then there's the guys that actually have to carry it out and make it happen. And it's through these power control groups, people like Mark Lane, that's facilitated. And to some degree, they're out there kind of as entrepreneurs, as business people within this particular arena, like saying, oh, hey, man, 78% of the public are out there not believing your story. You better be doing some PR on this. Hey, I got a new book coming out. Maybe you can, maybe you can throw some money this way, because otherwise it might blow up.
Yeah, you better come up with a way to shut these people down, right? Shut people's critical thinking down. Maybe you could denigrate anybody with an alternative viewpoint or a question, even a question, and call them despicable conspiracy theorists in the press, and try to get. It's kind of like the cancel culture of the day, right? That's how they did it, and then, Mike, like tying that back to like Henry Luce and Time Life and C.D. Jackson and people who did psychological operations and propaganda in World War II and then came out. And I like to think that my mental model was like, hey, they were facing this stuff externally to the world to align them to war or to defeat the Axis powers. But in reality, they were actually practicing on the U.S. domestic population at all times from the
Yep.
days of Edward Bernays and even before, right, to get us into World War One, and then to convince people that the Germans were, they were bad, and that persisted after the war was over, and during the war and after the war was over, and then once the Galen org was co-opted into the CIA, and they just changed the name on the door from the Nazi Intelligence East to the CIA, then things started to change, right? To loosen up for the Nazis a little bit. And
Yeah.
oh, those are our Nazis. And
Well, it's interesting though that like the psychological warfare that went on in World War II, and certainly a lot of Americans and a lot of energy that was devoted into psychological warfare during World War II that was in their eyes probably legitimate. Now basically becomes that expertise is then employed. Well, where are you going to employ it? Well, in the
yeah,
business world.
yeah,
you know, and essentially wherever the money takes us, we're willing to, employ these tactics.
yeah, for
And to
hire
some degree,
Bernays.
it's this idea of the Hegelian dialectic where you've got these two sides, and one side is the official story, and the other side is the controlled opposition. And as long as you got people running to either side, you're taking them on the trip to where it's going. But in doing that, you're creating kind of a power hierarchy of the value that represents the storyline, and who is involved, and how valuable it is. Because the things that relate to kind of the deep funnel, those are the most expensive places. And for people like this, they're trying to steer the narrative.
Yeah, so
I'm
many
sure that
thoughts coming up.
commands a lot of money and power.
Oh yeah, so many thoughts are coming up when you talk about this. Like, I can picture the guy, the 9/11 criminal who said that, it's just a story, it's a myth, created the 9/11 myth. I've forgotten what his name is. It'll come to me. But then,
Karl Rove.
well, there's Karl Rove, and there was another guy. Um, he was a university professor, and he was in the Bush administration. It'll come to me. I'll figure it out. Then the other thing that struck me was that, yeah, you have Fox and you have CNN, and anything in between is okay, right? Then you have Tucker Carlson over here denying that 9/11 was a conspiracy, right? He said he's towing the government line and just denigrating people who won't say it. But then he's also stirring
Noam
people up. Like,
Chomsky.
yeah, Noam's doing the same thing, right? Noam and Ben Shapiro, they're pissing on people who have questions about 9/11, and it's controlled opposition. And like you said, they're escalating, right? They're escalating with these events, and they get people emotionally tied up. And there was something else I read today about that, how to control people with fear, and the recipe and the method for controlling people with fear. And we're going to go back into that a little bit further. But so the other thing that came up, Michael, when you're talking about that was, my wife and I were just looking around for something to watch the other night, right? And late at night, and we pulled up Bewitched, right? So it was, and I know that I Dream of Jeannie was around NASA, right? They worked at NASA.
Yeah.
And Bewitched, like, they worked at an advertising agency. Like, Darren worked at the advertising agency, and one of the women who was competing with the wife there was worked at NASA, and so that was very strange. And then when they start going into the show, well, they're moving to the suburbs, and it talks about the kind of home that they would like and why they would like to live in the suburbs. And then when they see the wonderful home, and it has all these, she's in there using a juicer, and the stoves are there, and all the appliances of this modern kitchen are there, and they're just selling the whole time. And it really just hit me like, that's the stuff that we were programmed with. That's the stuff that people were programmed with. And if you can go back with a critical eye and watch, you can see all this stuff like it's in your face and
Yeah.
it just hits you like a ton of bricks. And you're like, and it's, they have to become ever more sophisticated over time as people realize what's going on. And I believe that that's happened. And I
Yeah.
believe that that's how they're able to pull off some of the recent events and fool so many people who are still fooled, right?
Well, and I think the thing is it's, like with the way like Larry Flynn operated, where they got all this information, they got all this stuff, from all these different people, and they were able to basically filter and control those things. Similarly, like the way that Facebook and social media operates, you've got this circumstance where they can reward and punish people that, for the most part can be useful idiots that are basically expressing the ideas that they need. They can send followers their way, they can donate money to their cause, and they can, make that particular person more popular, and really insulate themselves from like people figuring out who's controlling the stuff. But the reality is that they're supporting like an ideology or a conflict going on between the two sides,
Yeah.
by just giving them followers and giving them a little bit of support, and essentially like diminishing the support of people that are actually creating narratives and just discussing ideas that they don't want people to hear. And so to some degree it's like this ability to like focus and unfocus in a funnel of a narrative.
Yeah. You filter and it's like a black hole. Things go in and they don't come out. And if you say too much, you might actually go in and not come out too.
Yeah, well, that's that like the ultimate thing. Instead of killing people, you can just censor them. You can just basically ban them from Facebook or whatever, and now they can't talk to anybody. Their influence is gone. They basically died, and you don't have to kill them. You just remove their audience.
So it was amazing, like the rise of Facebook and Twitter and the government, like, oh, the president is tweeting, right? Well, oh, the Twitter says this, right? And so that they're supported, so that that's their vehicle, and that's how I interpret it, right? When I see things on the mainstream media, I'm like, nobody gets on there without paying or being the vehicle. So what is it that they're trying to do and say and use these vehicles for?
Yeah.
Then when Musk goes to buy Twitter and they're like, oh, this thing's just a piece of crap, it's just a bunch of bots, right? It's like, yeah, oh,
Yeah.
you're telling me, right? Like, how can you have, or you're going to buy this company that's told by the CDC what to allow to have on their platform, and it's just crawling with bots, like some huge percentage of their traffic and their conversation is not real.
Right.
So it just exposes the underbelly of the psyop
Yeah.
on people.
Yeah, and the control of the narrative again, because like I saw a thing where they had I don't know what's the like the Democratic lady that's OEC or OE
AOC, yeah,
AOC, yeah. And she made some tweet and she got like 600,000 retweets or something like that, whatever it was. But it's like, who the hell retweeted this? This is complete idiocy, But the thing is they have that ability to like make that a piece of the nightly news and have that in the discussion. And to a large degree, it is really about attention. Like, where is people's attentions focused, and who has the ability to influence that attention? And when they create influencers, and they can create these kind of small and niche influencers, they can steer a movement.
It's torches of freedom. Yeah.
Yeah, torches of freedom on the suffragettes.
They keep taking care of us with that.
So So there's that, Amos, and then there's like the infiltration and the controlled opposition of any group that doesn't belong, or that's what COINTELPRO was about, right? And you could see that in anybody that gets traction, like the Tea Party group, right? They had traction, and then they just got blown apart by neocons. Um, and they call them neocons, but I think they'd be better off called Trotskyites or Marxists, something like that,
Yeah.
right? And it's a misnomer for what they really are, and so that's part of the using the language against the people as well. So they turn that language against the people, just like the turning the word anarchy or anarchist against people. An anarchist is just somebody who wants to be left alone, have no government, and to interact with voluntary choice as opposed to force, fraud, and coercion that we're all accustomed to. And I think that force, fraud, and coercion, that they've made it so subtle, so pervasive, that it's like we're swimming in water and we don't even know it. But and the more that we recognize it and realize, the more disturbing it is actually. And so having conversations like this, finding like-minded people who kind of get it, can be critical and grounding, so that we're not falling victim to the gaslighting that's going on, because it can make you feel crazy.
Well, I think that, I think if you reverse engineer this thing, then you can kind of go back through history and you can look at these escalation moments and what was the discussion? What was the discussion before the escalation moment and what was the discussion after? Because if those are the primary kind of discussions that are going on, or maybe it's, two kind of contrary discussions going on before and what was before. But I think that's certainly something to, like, if we're going to look at things in the past and then looking at things that are going on like right now, and what are these things, what are these escalation points in these particular discussions that we're having, and what is the discussion going on, is there anything missing that we should be discussing?
You hit the nail on the head for me, because what I'm hearing is like all these discussions of the scientific papers, right? The scientific papers, they don't agree with the mainstream narrative, and down to the nth degree of the statistics and the this and the that. And they're keeping people focused on, okay, that's enough to make you angry and get you distracted and keep you off balance. And it is angering and it is maddening, and people are being murdered, and the powers that be are doing it. So it is very disturbing. But by going into all of the fine detail and all the specific avenues, and okay, maybe it's helpful to have people do that, but what's not helpful is to just be down that rabbit hole and not to see the big picture of what's actually going on, because you miss everything else. You miss other things that are actually going on that could be impacting you to a much greater degree, being focused on these things. And you want to keep your hand out of the alligator's mouth. You don't want to step on that landmine. You want to have your critical thinking to keep you from getting sucked into these honey traps. And it could be very dangerous and even potentially deadly to fall into some of these traps. And you can't avoid all of them, but we can avoid more than none. Let's put it that way.
Well, but it is one of those things where even, like for those of us that are in the alternative media and we're looking for popularity and influence, we need to realize that, like, when those days come, when the influence comes, we've got to be ready to, like, question, where is this coming from? Where is this interest coming from? Are these real people? Is this money real? Is this, is this crowdsourced, or is this just, a couple particular people that are dropping in,
Goodness, that was one of the things that she said about Mark Lane, and that was in these articles, was that he would pretend to be a reporter instead of a lawyer for the opposition, and then go interview people. And they in the Ronan Farrell article about Harvey Weinstein, like he employed Black Cube and Kroll against the women that he had sexually abused or harassed to buddy up to them to find out what they knew, and then he deployed them against journalists as well. So they formed a shell companies that had a website with a little bit of drivel on it, and then they would meet with the victims and try to get as much information out of them as they possibly could. And May talks about the one time when they brought the serial killer over to her house to visit, right? And so, you gotta have the radar up.
Yeah. Well, this last Anarchapulco, I was talking to one of the attorneys that worked with the Bundys on their legal challenge to the United States government on their land. And he was talking about how, this documentary film crew came in, and they were essentially like a FBI team.
Yeah.
And they were interviewing people, and they look like normal people, like they're interested in getting the message out in the news, and they're very personable and all that stuff. But they ended up just they were collecting all the information about them, who feels like what, who are the people that are influential, who are the people that know what's going on, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, they're just framing out the stakeholders so they can understand the picture.
Yeah. So they're collecting information in a lot of different ways, and of course with social media, that's relatively easy to do. But again, this is kind of that situation where when there's something that's of interest to the powers that be, that could unsettle whatever the narratives that they're trying to tell, that's a entrepreneurial opportunity for these kind of people to get in there and basically know what's going on and who's doing what.
Yeah, it's like COINTELPRO is just metastasized.
Yeah, it's like it's the COINTELPRO has just become decentralized, I think.
Standard course of business. Yeah.
And, all this counterinsurgency stuff and COINTELPRO and all that, it always, you get the picture like from Mark Lane and stuff like that, and other people that are, writing about it and making movies about it. Well, it all points to the CIA. It points to the deep state, but in fact, there's real people behind all this. They're trying to sell the Bundy's land to the Chinese who want to put up wind, whatever the turbines and all that stuff. I mean, but there's always a sort of obfuscation that, is like taking us to look back at, it's the CIA, it's whatever that is,
Yeah. It's
and
a big black
state.
box.
Yeah. Exactly. So I mean, it's pretty fascinating.
People that can be named.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the thing is I think every industry, every government organization has different factions, and to some degree they do compete for these services and taking on one side versus the other and doing it well. And so to some degree there is there's always opportunities for those of us that are trying to understand this thing to be able to, once we understand the thing, to pit these differing influences and influencers against each other, because there is there's always, with every carrot there's a stick. And just like with Epstein, that they're collecting the bad stuff on people just as quickly as they're throwing out money in front of them.
Yeah. It's fascinating. I think we should study mafia culture, and then we would be much more informed as to what's going on. I like watching this Italian shows in Italian about the Sicily and stuff, and the last one I watched was a story from a view of like a 9-year-old boy, and it was really good. And the final show, his friend, who was the head of the anti-mafia police squad, and they had he would come to the coffee shop, and he would get advice from him, and then he would get little things fixed for the kid and take care of him. So the last show was when he was assassinated, and the kid witnessed it, and then they were trying, his father found out, and they kept quiet, but finally they couldn't hold it anymore, so they had to tell the police, which eventually, of course, got right back to the mafia. And then the brother who was in the mafia said, okay, you guys got to leave town, get in the car right now, or you're out of here. And so they get on the ferry, and then the kid has some kind of epiphany and runs off the ferry back into the town. He's like, I finally figured out who the mafia is, and we're in a war. And what kind of came to me was, the mafia is all of us. That's the thing. That's what came to me. Like, it's just human nature, and it's kind of all of us. And like, what the hell, you can't run away from it somehow. I guess you can, but
Well, that's where the isolation and stuff comes in, the fact that we're all kind of traumatized and we all have blind spots. It's easy for us to, especially in a fiat economy where, we got to justify a living to some degree. We can be doing the bad stuff or helping participate in the bad stuff without really knowing about it, and really be lying to ourselves that, that we're part of the problem. And that's another element. And certainly when we're isolated and we don't have any feedback from anybody else, then it's less likely that we're going to discover that we're part of the problem.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an opportunity for a lot of self-reflection, and fantastic. Well, guys, I so much appreciate you guys being here, and adding your thoughts and your knowledge, and having a great discussion. And I really like doing this, and having you guys to do it with is fantastic. So appreciate it. And with that, we will wrap it up.
Thanks, Tim.
And
Yeah.